yeah, super excited to give you a lot of information about Kickstarter, some basics, some things maybe you didn't know, which I'm always excited to kind of chat about. I have my notes on my phone. That's why I kind of keep looking over here. But anyway, so hi, I'm Anya. I'm the director of games at Kickstarter. I've been in the games industry almost 12 years. This will be my 12th year, so I guess I'm considered a vet, which is kind of cool. I got my start in Flash games. I'm the former developer relations person for Addicting Games. I was the person who found the Flash games for Addicting Games, which is kind of cool and exciting. I then went on to work for Nickelodeon. I did content development, production, mobile development, just a lot of different stuff over there. And now I am the director of games at Kickstarter, where I have been at Kickstarter about 4.5 years. It'll be 4.5 years next month, which is pretty cool. And my job at Kickstarter is to work with creators like yourself, to provide you with the tools and the tricks and the tips and things like that, just to kind of like make you be successful as you possibly can be. So a lot of that is communication. A lot of that is, Skype calls, Google Hangouts, a lot of stuff like that. And it used to be doing presentations like this all over the world, but in pre-pandemic or post-pandemic times, we're sort of doing what we can. But so Kickstarter's mission is to bring creative projects to life, and we think that we do that better than anyone. We do this by connecting people to the projects that they love, right? So being able to kind of see like, oh, cool, this project, my friend's working on this cool video game or tabletop game. And bringing that to Kickstarter and being able to be a part of that, which is pretty fantastic. So people from nearly every country on Earth have backed the project. So our community represents nearly every country and all 7 continents, and that does include Antarctica. So someone in Antarctica is backing Kickstarter projects, which I think is pretty cool. So Kickstarter has the largest and most engaged funding community. 17 million people have backed a Kickstarter project. And actually, of that 17 million people that have backed a Kickstarter project, 5.9 million have backed more than one project. So not only do we have a pretty robust group of people that are backing projects, but they're coming back and continuing to back projects. So thanks to that 17 million people, and I'm sure a lot of you are part of that, 61 million pledges have been made to all projects on Kickstarter. This is the 11 years that Kickstarter has created this, has been around. This is all-encompassing numbers. The background to this slide, by the way, is Berserk War of the Realms. I tried to tailor some of these slides to be very Russian-focused. Cool. So Kickstarter backers have already pledged $4.9 billion US. We suspect we'll get to about $5 billion this year. And so thanks to all of the wonderful backers, this has helped fund over 181,000 creative projects, which is pretty significant. It's a very large platform. But we're here to talk about games, obviously. So just to kind of give you a little bit of context about the games category. So games has pledged $1.2 billion. We had $1 billion pledged in April of 2019, so last year, which is pretty exciting. That's helped fund over 21,000 successful projects. And also a quick note, of that 1.2 billion pledged, that means 1.1 billion have been raised. So it's games is a huge part of the world of Kickstarter, which is pretty exciting. And we have 3.8 million backers just in games, which is pretty cool. And I wanted to put in this success rate because I think it's really interesting, and we'll kind of dive into it a little bit more. But there's about a 40% success rate for games, but it's important to note that Kickstarter as a whole is actually 37%. So games is very, very successful on Kickstarter, has a very high success rate. And we don't necessarily like to look at games in 2 categories, but it is kind of how the sort of system is broke down, which is video games and tabletop games. So video games, 258 million has been pledged to just video games. Of that 258 million, 222 million is successful. So it's a pretty large crop. 14,300 projects have launched. about 3,100 have been successful, and there's about 1.8 million backers in video games. So you'll see this video game success rate, which is 21.8%. That is of all time. So that's the 11 years of Kickstarter. But it's important to note that in 2019, that number was actually 26.5. So the success rate in video games last year was 26.5, and the success rate this year in 2020 so far is 24.5. And these numbers are sort of constantly fluctuating. A lot of these stats are publicly available, but the sort of distilling down into very specific categories, that's something you can always reach out to me. I'm happy to kind of give you that information. I wanted to put this slide in because one of the criticisms that we hear a lot about video games on Kickstarter is that there's just a whole crop of games that launch and they don't come out. And the truth is it's just kind of not true. So I wanted to highlight a couple of these games that are really successful Kickstarter projects that maybe you didn't know were actually Kickstarter projects. Night and Bikes, for example, was nominated for a handful of BAFTAs this year, which is pretty cool. Pathfinder, Kingmaker, we're going to talk about sort of their journey a little bit later in this presentation, but they came back this year with their newest game. Pray for the Gods, which has just received a significant amount of critical success. Iron Harvest too, which I've seen all over the place, which is pretty cool. I just saw it at PAX East back in February. Super Hot, you know, that's just completely blown up, which is pretty cool. So there's just countless games. A couple that I actually didn't include in here are also Moonlighter, That Dragon Cancer, which I highly recommend you check out, Pinstripe, Home Free, Strafe, Chaos Reborn, Amplitude, Jenny LeClue. There's a huge crop of video games that are doing extremely well. I would also just want to note something that I think is really important, that there was an independent study done on Kickstarter in 2015. And we found that 90% of projects actually do come out. So I'm sort of constantly fighting back against this narrative that if you launch a project on Kickstarter, if you back a project on Kickstarter, suddenly, you know, you're never going to see the project that you backed. The reality is it just takes a little bit longer for video game development versus tabletop game development. But when the projects do come out and they're successful, we always do our best to celebrate in the success of things that are happening. So video games, still alive, still kicking. We had three $1 million video games this year alone, which also included something that I'm very proud of, which is the Sabotage Studios Sea of Stars, which funded this year, which is pretty exciting. But it's important to also talk about tabletop games, obviously, sort of the heart and soul of Kickstarter, some would say. So it's robust, right? $908 million pledged. 864 of that has actually been successfully raised. 23,750 projects, about 14,100 are successful. I think that number is actually a little bit higher. Again, each day, each week, this is constantly changing. 2.1 million backers. So people are constantly backing tabletop projects, which is pretty cool. And you can see it's a very high success rate, 60%. In 2019, again, that 60% represents the full lifespan of Kickstarter. 2019, it was 66.9%, and so far in 2020, it's 70.4%. So tabletop games are pretty big, which is really exciting. Games in 2019, I thought I really wanted to highlight this just to kind of showcase, like, you know, the power of games on Kickstarter, especially from last year, which we had a crazy year. So $653 million pledged just for that year, and $563 million was successfully raised, which is pretty cool. 19,400 projects, that's successfully raised projects. That's how many projects were successful last year. And 3.3 million backers, which is really cool. It's also a 46.3% success rate, which is really exciting. And I think it's important to note that that success rate is the highest that it's been since 2011. We also just had March and April are record months for us on Kickstarter, which is pretty cool. And again, I mentioned this earlier, but I think it's really important to highlight $4.9 billion pledged to the whole of Kickstarter. 1 billion of that, over $1 billion of that now, is pledged just to games. So games is very much the heart and soul of Kickstarter as it currently exists. And I know I'm probably going to get some questions about this, so I did want to address it early on, how the pandemic and COVID and the situation globally that's happening, how it's affecting Kickstarter. The simple answer is it is affecting Kickstarter in the sense that pledges on Kickstarter as a whole are down. They're down about 30%, but I would keep in mind that games is one of 15 major categories on Kickstarter, right? So we have music, dance, theater, food, art, design, and technology. And the projects that are being mostly, that have seen the effect of these pledges being down is more projects that sort of require in-person experiences. So for example, dance, I don't know how you create a dance project at a time when you're not allowed to be around people. It's the same with theater. It's the same to a certain degree with music, although I would say with music, Meredith, who is our director of music, has done an incredible job of reaching out to venues to get them to come to Kickstarter and really build projects that are about sort of keeping the integrity of those venues alive. So music projects have shifted a little bit, but that's all to say that games is still definitely chugging along. Games is still, doing extremely well. We have seen a small effect. We've seen about 100 less projects every day. So typically on a day-to-day basis, there's between 500 to 600 live projects at any given time. And right now we're seeing about 470 to about 510 projects. And I think there's two ways to look at this. While it kind of sucks that we are seeing people kind of be a little bit more hesitant about launching projects, the other side of this is there's a little bit more room for projects to kind of shine through. So I'd say it's kind of up to you how you want to look at it. At the end of the day, we still also really encourage people to think about what is best for you and your team. If you're not in a place where you're ready to launch a project, or you don't want to launch a project, or you want to wait to kind of see how this, just sort of unprecedented time is going to affect everyone, if it's people losing their jobs, if it's, needing to just think about your finances a little bit more diligently, that's totally fine. We're not going to go anywhere. We're here to kind of support you and help you as best as we can. So what are the requirements to launch a project? And there's a couple things to talk about here. So I took this screenshot, which is just basically sort of our rules of what is required to launch a project. So project creation is currently available to individuals, and you can kind of read all of the countries that we're currently available in. You do need to be 18 years or older. So if you're under 18, or you know someone who's under 18 that's interested in running a project, typically we just get a parent or a guardian to kind of run the project for them. You need to be a permanent resident of one of the above listed eligible countries. And you need to be creating the project in your own name or on behalf of a registered legal entity with which you are affiliated. Your address, your bank account, and your government issued ID based in the country that you're creating a project in, you need to have all of that. And if you're running the project as an individual, the linked bank account must belong to the person who verified their identity for your project. And then again, major credit or debit card, US-centric brain. And you need to have the authority to represent the organization to our payments partner, Stripe. So you might be asking yourself, well, I'm not listed in one of those countries, or maybe I have, I don't have a credit card, or I don't have a debit card, or there's two other things maybe that you're sort of like, well, shoot, I don't actually meet those requirements. So one of the questions I get is like, what if my country isn't listed? And there's a couple different ways to get around this. One thing that we see is if you have like a family member, a friend, or a colleague that is in one of the countries that we do currently support, they can run the project for you. You have the option to be a collaborator on the project. There's pros and cons to this, but we see it done pretty consistently, especially again, where people are listed in a country that isn't currently supported by Kickstarter. You can also create a business account in the US. There's pros and cons to that. I sort of generally encourage people to reach out to friends or colleagues or other game developers that are in countries that currently aren't supported by Kickstarter and kind of see what they've done. There's always kind of ways to kind of like finagle your way into the process. I would note that we are looking to open in 3 new countries this year, hopefully in September. We'll kind of see, like everyone else, COVID has kind of thrown us into a bit of a tailspin. But we're looking to open in Poland, Greece, and Slovenia. So if you are in one of those countries and you're interested in learning more, I have my contact information at the end of this presentation. I'm happy to chat. So we've looked at sort of the numbers and we've looked at the stats, and we've seen that obviously games are, a very big part of Kickstarter. And so let's say that you're sort of thinking of launching a project, but you want to know like what actually makes a good project, right? And I sort of break this into two categories, which are just very simple yeses and very simple nos. So the yeses, first of all, is gameplay. Especially for video games, you need to have 30 seconds of gameplay. And it needs to be something that's pretty close to what the project is going to look like. What I mean by that is if you have a prototype and you're just using like boxes or like, symmetrical sort of figures, but it's not going to be representative of what the actual project is going to look like. Unfortunately, that's not going to fly on Kickstarter. So it needs to be something that's going to be as close to what the final project is going to look like. Art doesn't need to necessarily be final. If there's like a little bit of touching up that needs to be done, totally fine. But if you show something in 3D and then it ends up being in 2D, that's a conversation that needs to be had. Your video should be short, very short video, 2 to 3 minutes in length at the most. Even 1 to 2 minutes is more preferred. And it doesn't need to be this like big cinematic experience of like hiring a videographer or anything like that. Shooting something on a mobile phone is totally fine. I have this external camera that I was trying to use, but it was kind of messing everything up. But even something like this is completely fine, especially now when we're in a state where, leaving our homes is not recommended. Don't do it. So keeping your video short. Your video should be 30 seconds of gameplay right in the beginning. That is absolutely imperative and something that is a must. If you can include any information about like who you and your team are and why you're coming to Kickstarter, that's totally fine. I also get a lot of questions from people that will say, I don't really want to be on camera. Do I have to show my face? And the answer is no, you absolutely don't. You can do VO. You can have someone else do it. That's also totally fine. It's more just about getting that information out there than anything else. Community building. I could do a very long talk about community building, but community building is really the key to a successful Kickstarter project. So if you, let's say, for example, you say, I need $50,000, that's my funding goal, and $20 is where my general sort of price point is for like the base reward. So if you divide your funding goal by what the base reward price is, which is just the game, nothing else, that kind of tells you how many people need to pledge. So in that case, it would be 2,500 people. I recommend doubling that in terms of community building. The community building side too is a little bit more than just like jumping on Twitter. Twitter is a very it's a very impactful tool for the games industry, right? Like the entire games industry is on Twitter, but it's not just as simple as like having a Twitter and following a bunch of people. You kind of need to grow it. You need to engage with the community a little bit. But you also want to think about other social media platforms. So if that's like Facebook, potentially Reddit. I know there's some like rules and challenges with Reddit, but just thinking about it. And also Discord. Discord is a really, really, really important part of the games industry. So making sure that you have a Discord for your studio, your team, your game, whatever it is. Again, mentioning Sabotage Studios again, I would definitely see if you could check out their Discord and see what they've done. They did an incredible job of really building that community up. Your main project image. So that main project image right before your video plays, or basically what that video shows, that is extremely important on your project page. And we'll kind of go through what some of those look like. But it should be very representative of what the game is. So if it's just text of the game name, that doesn't really show anyone kind of what the game is. It just shows what the game name is, right? So having like characters, maybe a still from the game, something like that. You also don't want to have any badges. So if you have badges that say like live on Kickstarter, funded in 48 hours, any sort of just like extra information, it really distracts from what the project is. So we just don't recommend having those. You can have those on the actual project page, but avoid having those on the actual main project image. Be honest, right? So again, when we're talking about video games specifically, development delays are extremely common. I think it's okay as long as you're communicating to your backers in your community, hey, we have to re-up our license. We have to buy a new computer, something, whatever is happening, just be very, very honest about it. People are going to be a lot more willing to, engage and communicate with you if you're just honest. But if you ghost people, it's never good. And lastly, two actual things, 30 to 35 day project. So we see people that ask this a lot. Well, shouldn't I run a 45 to 60 day project? Shouldn't I run a 20-day project? We've done a fair amount of research on this, and it's really interesting. For whatever reason, 30 to 35 days tends to be like the best time frame to run a project. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. Especially here in the US, the way that our paychecks typically work is we get paid every 2 weeks, or roughly on the 15th and the 30th of every month. Every company is different, but that's generally the case. So 30 to 35 days gives you the option to hit those 2 payment periods for people. In addition to that, there's a trajectory that happens on every Kickstarter project. And again, we'll look at that when we kind of dive into a couple projects a little bit more. But roughly the first 2 days has a very significant amount of activity. So you'll see a high level of pledges. And then you kind of go through a project plateau, sort of leading into the last 2 days. And the last 2 days tend to mirror the first 2 days. So you want to keep that sort of time frame where anything over that, it's too long. People kind of forget about it. And anything less than that, you're not only not going to hit those payment cycles, but also it's just not enough time for people to kind of think about things. So we looked at the yeses, and let's look at the nos. So a couple of things that you are just sort of big no's on Kickstarter: not having a video. Especially if it's your first or second project, you can't get away with not having a video. You need to be able to show kind of like what this project is, what this game is. Never posting an update. I see this more often than I would like, but so games is really interesting. Games, you need to post an update every other day, right? There's sort of a famous case of Hyper Light Drifter where I believe the situation, this was before my time at Kickstarter, but from what I can remember, they reached their funding goal, and then they posted something like 8 updates in a small amount of time. And that's too many updates. But if you post once a week, that's too little updates. So an update every other day is definitely key. So you might think to yourself, but I don't know how to bring all together, how much content do I need to have for an update? And it doesn't need to be anything that's super long or very in depth. It can be something as simple as just oh, we have new art and we're excited to show it off. Hey, we reached 45%. That's awesome. Sort of just even small little things are super important. So we sort of recommend have the first couple updates ready to go. So that way you can edit them really quickly, or you can just kind of fire them out. Having a bad launch day. So in addition to the 30 to 35 days, having the actual day that you launch is extremely important. So we found that Tuesdays and Wednesdays tend to be the best days to launch. That doesn't mean that Thursday or Monday is a bad day, but for whatever reason, Tuesdays and Wednesdays seem to be the best days. That does, however, mean that Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, those are bad days to launch. They are not good launch days. People are checked out. They're thinking about the weekend. They're not checking Kickstarter on the weekend. In addition to that, ending on the weekend, ending on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday also tends to not be good. And then a quick sort of small caveat to that. You also want to avoid launching and ending on any major US holiday or any major holiday in your country. People just aren't at their computers then. So don't end or launch on any major holidays in the US or in the country that you're launching in. Stretch goals. This is such a topic of contention, but we do not recommend having any visible stretch goals on your project. Stretch goals tend to kind of distract from the actual project itself. So your stretch goals should be something that you roll out when you've met your funding goal. Your stretch goals also should not be used as a way to sort of get the actual amount of money it is that you want. So what I mean by that is, if you know that $50,000 is your funding goal, but you're asking for 30, hoping that the stretch goals will entice people to bump you up to 50, that's a really dangerous game that you're playing. So instead, you should ask for 50, and then hope that the stretch goals will kind of lead you up to maybe other amounts for things that you could potentially add to the game. But showing your visible stretch goals, especially if, again, your funding goal is 50 and you're like, this is my stretch goal for $1 million, there's just sort of a level of like people of authenticity that needs to be thought about. Press reliance. This is another big one that I see a lot. So press for us is not just like, digital press, like Kotaku, Polygon, or Rock, Paper, Shotgun, anything like that. That does include things like streamers and influencers and YouTubers and things like that. If you can get press, if you can get people to play your game over Twitch or Mixer, or YouTube, whatever, that's great and that's fantastic. And we are by no means saying that you shouldn't try to, go after that. You should. But the thing is, those rarely bring in actual pledges to the Kickstarter project. So the way we sort of encourage people to look at it is if you can get sort of like your friend or your favorite streamer to stream your game, if you can, get an article in some publication, that's fantastic, but don't expect it to really bring in a significant amount of pledges. And lastly, ghosting. Don't ghost your backers. Make sure that you're communicating with people. Respond to every comment. Respond to every message that you get, provided it's not spam. Engage with your backers. They want to see you succeed. So like have them be a part of the process with you. So this is a big question I get too, but what if I fail, right? I have a failed Kickstarter project and it's embarrassing. So I kind of challenge that notion. To me, there's no such thing as a failed Kickstarter project. And what I mean by that is if you launch a project and it doesn't fund, that's literally it. You just have a project that didn't fund. Doesn't mean that it's failed. It doesn't mean that you have like a red mark against you or anything. You just have a project that didn't fund the first time around. And that's totally okay. You can come back and you can relaunch. To me, the only time a person has like failed on Kickstarter is if they didn't learn anything during the process. To me, that is the worst thing that can possibly happen. But if you've launched your Kickstarter and it didn't fail the first time around, but maybe you got a publisher, maybe you met a new programmer, maybe you met a new artist, like that's a success story to me. That's totally fine. How do I get featured? So this is actually definitely the number one question that I get. So the simple answer is it's actually not an algorithm. There's a misconception that there's this algorithm on Kickstarter that sort of pulls like projects that have high value, like high amounts of money and high backers and things like that. And it's not true. All features are managed by people. We have a team, an editorial team that goes in and will like click projects for like, this is a Kickstarter project we love, a staff pick. We get projects in newsletters and things like that. So what does that team look for? And how do I, as the director of games, how do I advocate for you as creators, since the editorial team is always asking me like what projects should we feature? So you want to again have a strong project image. That strong project image is extremely important. Again, showcasing the game, and we'll kind of go through, and you'll kind of see like maybe some of the projects that I'm talking about, they have words on the actual game or on the actual project image, and I'll explain why it's kind of okay. Gameplay GIFs. You need to have GIFs kind of scattered throughout your page. Again, especially for video games. And talk to us early and often. We basically tell people like the time that you, like the moment you start thinking, I think I want to run a Kickstarter project, that's when you want to talk to us. And I have my contact information at the end of this presentation, so you can always reach out to me. And the games newsletter. So we have about 180,000 subscribers just to the games newsletter. And that's actually something that I personally curate. And I'm happy to get you in the games newsletter, but it's something, again, that I need to sort of time it appropriately, and I need to make sure that I'm like in communication with you. So make sure that you're in communication with me or Michael Lieb, who's our German outreach, all of Europe actually. And we have a new hire starting next week, which I'm keeping secret for now, but it will be announced. But he's going to help us out a lot too. So if you're sort of asking, like, you mentioned badges, but like, what exactly are you talking about? These are the badges that we're talking about. Do not have these on your project main image anywhere. If anyone on our editorial team sees these badges, automatically you will not be considered for any features. It just really distracts from the actual project. So our team really hates that. So I'm gonna go through a couple projects here and kind of talk about like what made them successful. So the first one I want to talk about is Pathfinder Kingmaker. And again, you might be saying, but you said don't have any text on the main project image. In this case, something like this is fine. And the reason it's fine is it still showcases what the game is. It's not just text, right? So just having the name, it's like, well, I don't really get what this is. This actually gives me a lot of information, which is really cool. So I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. This is actually a team from Moscow, which is really cool. And they came to Kickstarter in 2017. They raised over $900,000, which is pretty exciting. I think their goal was $500,000. This is the Owlcat Games, again, from Moscow. They ran a 35-day campaign right within that time frame that we're talking about, and they had over 18,000 backers, which is pretty cool. And if you're not familiar, this is an isometric single-player RPG based on the Pathfinder RPG Kingmaker adventure path, which is pretty cool. So this is sort of what you see on the back end of things. So when you launch a Kickstarter project, this provides you a lot of information, which is just simple Google Analytics. And so just to kind of like parse down kind of what we're looking at. So if you look on the right side, right under the word pledges, you'll see a pie chart. And there's sort of like an orange and a green part. That green part are the amount of pledges that is brought in through Kickstarter. So that's people finding the game organically, just sort of like searching around on Kickstarter. And again, what we saw right at the beginning of this presentation, 17 million backers, 5.9, I believe, are repeat backers. People come back and they constantly back projects again and again, especially in games. There's a high number of repeat backers. That green part, also just to kind of note, that does include, in addition to just finding the game was on Kickstarter, any sort of features, any sort of like social media mentions, anything like that that Kickstarter can provide. And that orange part of the pie, that represents projects that are that have come in through the community that Owlcat Games was able to build. So that's through Facebook, Twitter, potential press. Again, such a small amount, it just doesn't make much of a dent. But that also includes any sort of like, people that retweet anything, for example. That includes any like friends that have like sent things out to their newsletters. Anything that's off of Kickstarter, that's what that represents. So it's a pretty significant amount. There's also a second little line here, which is sort of a purpley color. It says 0%. We'll go into what that is in a couple different projects, but that's actually custom referral tags, which is extremely, extremely interesting. But the other side of this, and I'm sorry, actually, just to quickly mention just how we sort of think about this pie chart. So roughly what we see is about 30 to 34% of pledges that come into games projects. I mean, each project is different. So again, this is very much a sort of round number. So 30 to 34% of your pledges are most likely going to come in through Kickstarter. Again, that's any features that Kickstarter can provide, that's people finding the game, any organic discovery on Kickstarter. So that means you as a creator, and this is why community building is so important, you're responsible to bring in roughly 65 to 70% of your pledges. This is pretty indicative here. This is a very common thing that we'll see. And again, each project is different, so those numbers might fluctuate a little bit, but on average, that's pretty typical. Lastly, I just wanted to talk about this line graph here, the sort of funding progress chart. So as you can see, like I mentioned earlier, the first 2 days, right, those first sort of 3 dots, those are high levels of activity. And then we sort of go through a bit of a project plateau period. And again, this line graph is extremely common. It basically just mirrors every single project that we're going to look at. But you can see they met their goal halfway through. This is, again, why we say 30 to 35 days is extremely important. And also why we tell people don't cancel your project if you haven't met your funding goal by like some random time. I've heard people say, oh, if I don't meet my funding goal in 48 hours, it means my project's going to fail. Well, if you're supposed to meet your goal in 48 hours, we'd tell you to run a 2-day project. Like, run the full gamut. It's extremely important. And lastly, if you look at the sort of the last 3 dots, it does mirror the first 2 dots. It might be a little bit less in terms of pledges that are brought in, but it's extremely, extremely important. And one of the reasons that's extremely important is this remind me button that's on the bottom of, right when you're about to pledge for a project, you can see this little remind me button. When you click that remind me button, it sends an email that says, great, the last 48 hours that this project is live, we're going to remind you that the project is live. And that's partially why, again, if we look at those last sort of 2 to 3 dots, that's why there's that huge graph, that huge sort of line that goes up. And again, every single project, for the most part, sees this. So that remind me button is really, really powerful. So the next project is actually a continuation of Pathfinder, which is kind of cool. So this is a Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. This is a follow-up to their 2017 project. Again, Owlcat Games, same team. Very similar project image. They sort of like found what their space is. So this is a new isometric single-player RPG. Again, set in the Pathfinder universe, an indirect sequel to Pathfinder Kingmaker. Now, one of the things that's really interesting that they did, and this is partially why an interesting stat about Kickstarter is the more that you run Kickstarter projects, the more likely it is that you're able to fund. And there's a couple different reasons why that is. The biggest is that you've basically just like gained trust. And the caveat here is that stat is only true if you've come out with a project. So one of the things that you're able to do, and they did this, and I just always encourage people to think about doing this, when you've run your first project, you still have the option to continuously update. So sending updates for your next project is really, really powerful because they had over 18,000 backers on that first project. They sent this as soon as their project was live, and they sent them to a live link. Sending people to live links is always better than sending to something that's not available yet. The only exception to that is a new feature that we have on Kickstarter, which is a sort of like a coming soon page that you're able to do once your project has been approved. So if you're running your second or third project, first update, or one of the updates that you'd want to send is sending people to sort of that like or launching soon page, because you can see how many people have like clicked on the little remind me button. And then the next update would need to be for exactly what they did here, which is we're excited for our new project. Oh, I missed a number here. That is actually 2 million. It should be 2 million. Sorry about that. So they obviously, they had a $300,000 goal, over $2 million raised, which is pretty exciting. And they funded in March 11 of this year. And again, a 35-day campaign. And they pretty much doubled their backers. They went from 18,000 to about 35,000, which is pretty cool. And you can see here when we look at their chart, they funded on their basically on their first day. It was the first or second day, I believe. And again, pie chart pretty much signals exactly what we talked about in the first project. 32% came in through Kickstarter, 67% came in externally. So that kind of fits within that 65 to 70, 30 to 34%, right? So they did an incredible job. And again, second project, kind of killed it. This is a project that funded in, let me just quickly look here, 2018, yes. So this is the Encased RPG, a post-apocalyptic RPG. This is from St. Petersburg. It's a tactical turn-based combat and intense non-linear storyline inspired by original Fallout and classic sci-fi novel. It's cool. They did a really, really good job. Their goal was about $86,000, or about 93,000 US dollars, 86,000 euro. So they obviously did an incredible job here, $114,000 raised. This is from Dark Crystal Games, and they had almost 3,000 backers, which is really cool. And again, 29-day campaign. Kind of goes against the 30 to 35, but it's still very much within that time frame. 28 is fine, 29 is fine, but like 20 days is a no-go. And this is where this gets really interesting to me, because this is where they kind of broke the mold a little bit. So a couple things happened here. One, 42% of their pledges came in through Kickstarter. It's a little bit higher than normal, but I wouldn't say that's like necessarily such a high amount that it's something that's not average. But if we're looking at the green and the orange, if we look at the purple part of the pie, this purple part of the pie is something that's called a custom ref tag. So the custom ref tag essentially allows you to create custom referral tags for different sort of campaigns that you're running. So if you're running like a Facebook ad or a Twitter ad or multiple Facebook ads, this gives you the option to kind of see like, cool, this Facebook ad did really, really well. This is how many pledges it brought in, but this Facebook ad didn't. I can run this first Facebook ad maybe a couple more times because it gained so much traction. And you can see how much money they were able to bring in through that. This is also really interesting to me because they kind of broke the mold a little bit. If you look at their line graph, it still kind of shares the same trajectory as all the other graphs do, but they have a couple spikes. And I think some of that is due to some of the ads that they placed. It's a little hard for us to sometimes kind of parse out exactly what's going on, especially since this project is 2 years old. But again, I wanted to show this because it shows, one, don't cancel your project. You never know what's going to happen. And the power of those custom referral tags is pretty high. This is a project called Black Book that I wanted to showcase, which is actually live right now, which is really cool. I unfortunately didn't have time this morning. It's almost 10 a.m. here in New York, so it's a bit of a weird early morning for me. But I know that I'm pretty sure that they have already funded, which is fantastic. They're such a great team. So the project is currently live. It's a small indie team out of Perm. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. I apologize if I didn't. It's a narrative-driven RPG rooted in Slavic mythology. It's an adventure with card-based combat, and you explore a world where reality neighbors myth, which is pretty cool. We had this in our room at PAX East this year, which was just an absolute delight to have them. So, oh, there we go. So it's currently live, 31-day campaign. I'm going to butcher the creator name, so I'm not even going to try. But they have a 35K funding goal, which is pretty cool. So one of the other things that we're able to help provide when we can is we love to have people in our room at conferences when we're allowed to actually, go outside. If that's something that you're interested in, I'm always happy to have that conversation. You can always just email me, and again, my information is at the end of this presentation. But I wanted to kind of showcase, again, this is about a week old, so this is a totally different graph. But if you look at those first 2 days, 2 to 3 days, again, huge spike in pledges. And the really interesting thing here is if you look at the referral numbers, at least the amount that it was able to bring in, it's pretty on par with how much was brought in through Kickstarter and also how much was brought in through the community that they were able to build, which is really, really cool. So I wanted to show this because this is from a project called Stones Hard, which is a project that funded in 2018. And this is something that I really encourage people to kind of do a little bit more, and I wish I saw more of it. They actually posted an update specifically letting their community know, hey, this is a friend of ours and they have a live Kickstarter project. You should go back it. That's sort of like creator helping of one another in the community of like, my friend has a live project, you should go back it, and sending people, like sending their community to their friends page. I think that's totally great. And I, again, truly wish that I saw more of it. It's really fantastic and it helps each other out. Provides like a sense of legitimacy, especially if it's like a brand new creator. And lastly, I talked a lot about video games here, but I would be remiss to not talk about Frosthaven, which funded this last month. It is now officially the most funded game on Kickstarter, which is pretty cool. It's also the third most funded game, or sorry, third most funded project in all of Kickstarter. This is actually the 5th project from Isaac and his team. They are the creators of Gloomhaven, which is also a hugely popular board game. It's a Euro-inspired dungeon crawling sequel to Gloomhaven, which is pretty cool. This team's actually based out of Indiana here in the US, Indianapolis. Or I'm not sure if they're in Indianapolis, but they are in Indiana. Anyway, $12.9 million pledged, right? Their goal was, I think it was $500,000. And they had 83,000 backers, which is huge. Or I'm sorry, it funded earlier this year. What is time? What are days? And they had, again, a 31-day campaign right within that time frame. Here's what's interesting, though. So 50% of almost 50% of their pledges actually came in through Kickstarter. Now, I don't want that to seem as though it's a situation where we gave them, crazy amounts of traffic or anything like that. There's a couple things happening. One, they created one of those like little pre-launch pages, and they had I think over like 10,000 people that clicked on that page. So it's people, as soon as this project was live, people immediately went straight to Kickstarter. So they went directly to the Kickstarter page rather than finding it necessarily on Twitter, on Facebook, or something like that. It was directly through that opportunity. Hugely impactful. They also had a pretty significant amount of customer referral traffic, which is really cool. I think they funded in like, I think it was 20 minutes. It was a very small amount of time. So even though they met that funding goal very quickly, as you can kind of see, I'm sorry, the little sort of goal sign is covering it, but you can see they still kind of had the first 2-day trajectory, same at the last 2 days. So even if you meet your goal very quickly, that sort of line graph is very consistent, which is kind of wild and kind of crazy. We also had them in the PAX East room, which is really cool. So if I can sum this up very quickly before we get to a very quick Q&A. I'm sorry, time is a little limited. What are the things that you want to think about when you're launching a Kickstarter project? Build your community, and build your community early and quickly and often. We recommend taking about 2 to 4 up to 6 months of time, just focusing on the community building. Show your gameplay. Showing your gameplay is absolutely key, absolutely important. 30 seconds is all that's necessary. Keep your videos short. Again, 1, 2, 3 minutes at the most in length. And remember, as I've shown, you don't need to fund on day one. Take the 30 to 35 days. Look at it as an opportunity to have 30 to 35 days of your time where you can like talk to your community, see what's going on. It should be a little, think of it almost as like a game in itself. And lastly, come talk to us. We want to talk to you. This is my contact information. You can email me at anya@kickstarter.com or games@kickstarter.com. I'm also on Twitter. My DMs are open. I'm happy to chat at ANYAYNA. And I'm happy to do Q&A now. Okay, so let's see. Impressive success rate, but what is the success rate for a recent year like 2019? So if I go up here, I think I answered this, but just to let you know, so success rate in 2019 was 46.3%. So I'm going to mark that as answered. Thank you, Pascal, for your question. There's a question from, a couple questions from Dennis. On Twitter. Are mobile games also good for Kickstarter? So mobile games. So mobile games are challenging on Kickstarter. So the challenge with mobile games are you need to find ways. So since Kickstarter is a rewards-based platform, you need to find ways to sort of incentivize people to back your project, right? So Steam, for example, right? Like for a video game, you fund the game and then you send a Steam code. Tabletop game, you get a shipment in the mail or you get a print and play, something like that. Apple and Google are very, they don't really allow codes to be given out as freely as, Steam or Humble does. So mobile games, you just need to find what that incentive is. I generally recommend staying away from mobile games as an option. If you want to include it in sort of a larger plan, that's totally fine. But just mobile games, it's nearly impossible to do.
All right. I think we still have time for questions. So
okay, cool. Are there any consultancy? Is the project good for Kickstarter, and how to make it in proper way? I don't know if I totally understand the question, but I will say, so one of my main responsibilities here at Kickstarter is to work with you as creators to make sure that your project is as I want to set you up to be as successful as you possibly can be. So my job is to look at your project in any state that it currently is and give you the tools and give you the feedback before you find yourself in a place to launch. So I'm essentially a consultant, even though I'm an employee of Kickstarter, but I'm essentially the person that you would want to talk to.
Okay, when will Russia be at list of available countries?
So that is actually up to our payments provider, which is Stripe. That is not up to Kickstarter. I can't give you a date, but I can say that we are actively working on opening in more countries currently.
All right. So thank you for the talk. Is there any successful projects baked without the initial external community?
So I think in the early days of Kickstarter, that would be a yes. But as of now, it's virtually impossible. having an external community is absolutely key. Again, when we look at that 70-30 split, 70% of the pledges come in through that external community.